People remember where they were when something does not add up. A man goes out for a short morning hunt and never comes home. A boat is found, but the person who used it is gone. There are no clear signs of struggle, no clear answers, only an explanation that seems to settle things too quickly. For years, this moment stayed frozen in time, accepted by some and questioned by others. What happened on the water that day was reduced to a simple conclusion, even though the details never fully aligned. This was not a case filled with noise or urgency. It was quiet, ordinary, and easily overlooked. That is what allowed it to last so long without being challenged. Before we go further, make sure to subscribe for more authentic and true crime stories. On the morning of December 16, 2000, Mike Williams left his home in Tallahassee, Florida, planning a duck hunting trip on Lake Seminole. It was a familiar routine. He was an experienced outdoorsman who knew the area well. He told his wife he would return later that day. The trip was not meant to be long, and there was no indication that anything unusual was expected. When Mike did not come home as planned, concern began to grow. Family members attempted to reach him, but there was no response. As hours passed, attention turned toward the lake. The location of the hunt was known, and search efforts were organized. Authorities found Mike's boat on the water later that day. The engine was running and his hunting equipment was still inside. His vehicle and boat trailer were located at the launch site, indicating that he had entered the lake as planned. What was missing was Mike himself. There were no clear signs of an accident, no visible injuries, and no witnesses who saw what happened. Search teams began combing the area. Divers entered the water and boats scanned the surface. The lake was known for wildlife, including alligators, which immediately influenced how the situation was viewed. Investigators examined the boat and the surrounding water but did not recover a body. Over the following days, search efforts continued. The absence of physical evidence made it difficult to determine exactly what had occurred. There was no blood in the boat, no personal items were found damaged or displaced in a way that clearly suggested violence. The environment itself became the central focus of explanation. Lake Seminole was known to be populated by large alligators. Officials stated that it was possible Mike had fallen into the water and been attacked. This theory did not require additional evidence beyond the presence of wildlife and the fact that his body was missing. Without a body to examine, the explanation quickly took hold. The disappearance was officially treated as an accidental death. The idea that Mike had been killed by alligators became the accepted narrative. Investigators concluded that his remains would likely never be recovered due to the conditions of the lake. With that determination, the case was closed. For many, the explanation seemed plausible. Accidents happen, especially in environments known for danger. The absence of evidence was used to support the conclusion rather than challenge it. No criminal investigation followed. No deeper examination of Mike's personal life or relationships occurred at that time. However, not everyone accepted the explanation. Mike's mother questioned how such a conclusion could be reached without physical proof. She raised concerns about the lack of injuries found in the boat and the speed with which the case was closed. Despite her objections, the official ruling stood. As time passed, life moved forward for those around Mike. His death was recorded as an accident, and legal matters proceeded under that assumption. Insurance claims were processed, records were finalized. The case faded from public attention. What remained were unanswered questions that had not been explored. Why was there no sign of a struggle if an attack occurred near the boat? Why was equipment left undisturbed? Why was the conclusion reached without the recovery of remains? These questions did not lead to action at the time. The disappearance became one of those cases explained by environment rather than evidence. The lack of a body closed the door on further inquiry rather than opening it. The explanation required no suspect, no motive, and no investigation beyond the initial search. This moment defined everything that followed. A decision made quickly would shape years of silence. The assumption of accident removed the case from criminal review and placed it beyond scrutiny. What happened on Lake Seminole that day was no longer a mystery in official records. It was treated as resolved. Yet resolution on paper does not always align with reality. The events of that morning were accepted without challenge by the system responsible for asking questions. The disappearance of Mike Williams entered history as a tragic accident, even though the foundation of that conclusion rested on absence rather than proof. As years passed after the accidental death ruling, the disappearance of Mike Williams settled into official silence. With no criminal designation attached to the case, there were no active investigators, no periodic reviews, and no expectation of new findings. The file remained closed, unchanged by time or circumstance. The absence of movement created a long stretch where nothing advanced through formal channels. Law enforcement agencies did not revisit the evidence because, in their view, there was no crime to investigate. Without a body or forensic material, the case did not meet the threshold for further action. The conclusion already reached was treated as sufficient. During this period, records related to Mike Williams existed largely as administrative documents. Reports outlined the discovery of the boat, the environmental explanation, and the official determination. These records were stored rather than examined. There was no investigative momentum to challenge what had already been decided. Public attention faded almost entirely. Media coverage diminished as there were no updates to report. The story no longer appeared in headlines or broadcasts. Over time, it became a quiet footnote in local memory rather than an ongoing concern. Within Mike Williams' family, the lack of activity reinforced a sense of unresolved loss. While legal avenues had been explored earlier, there was little left to pursue without new information. The system required evidence to move forward, and none had emerged. At the same time, personal relationships connected to Mike continued without scrutiny. Because the case was not treated as criminal, there was no examination of interpersonal dynamics, finances, or circumstances beyond the day of disappearance. These areas remained outside the scope of review. The classification of accidental death effectively insulated the case from reassessment. It placed the disappearance in a category where uncertainty was acceptable and inquiry was optional. That categorization shaped how the years unfolded. From an institutional perspective, the case represented closure. Resources were allocated elsewhere. Investigators moved on to active matters. The disappearance of Mike Williams was not considered unfinished business. The long period without investigation also meant that memories aged and records remained static. Witness recollections were not refreshed. Statements were not revisited. The absence of follow-up allowed details to remain untested. This extended silence did not generate pressure for action. Without a triggering event, there was no mechanism to reopen discussion. The lake remained the explanation, and the explanation remained unchallenged within official systems. Time passed unevenly. For the system, the case was complete. For those who questioned the ruling, the passage of years added weight to unanswered questions. Each year without review deepened the gap between official certainty and personal doubt. The case's dormancy demonstrated how easily a disappearance can fade when labeled accidental. Without formal recognition of possible wrongdoing, there is no framework for accountability. Silence becomes the default outcome. Despite the lack of official movement, the record of the case remained intact. Reports were preserved, documents were stored. This preservation would later matter, even though it had no immediate effect during this period. The coldness of the case was not marked by dramatic loss of evidence or abandoned leads. It was marked by inaction. The absence of activity became the defining feature of these years. What appeared settled on paper remained unsettled beneath the surface. The lack of investigation did not resolve doubts. It simply delayed confrontation with them. This stretch of time established the conditions under which change could eventually occur. A case that appears resolved can still be reopened if new information arrives. The years of silence did not erase the past, they only postponed its examination. At this point in the record, nothing had altered the official conclusion. Mike Williams' death was still classified as an accident. There were no suspects. No crime existed in the eyes of the law. The case remained dormant, defined more by what was not done than by what was. The stillness of these years would later stand in contrast to what followed. For now, the disappearance remained frozen in time, untouched by investigation, and shielded by an explanation that had never been tested beyond its initial acceptance. After the official ruling was issued, life continued outwardly unchanged, but acceptance was not universal. For Mike Williams' mother, the explanation offered by authorities never settled into certainty. The classification of her son's death as an accident left too many unanswered questions, and those questions did not fade with time. She focused first on what was missing from the record. There were no remains recovered. There was no physical evidence confirming an animal attack. The boat showed no damage consistent with a violent encounter near the surface. These gaps mattered to her because they formed the foundation of the conclusion. Without proof, certainty felt misplaced. While the case file was closed, she continued to seek information. She reviewed reports, spoke with officials, and pressed for clarification. Each effort returned the same answer. The lake was dangerous, alligators were present, accidents happened. The absence of evidence was treated as confirmation rather than cause for review. Her persistence was not framed as an accusation, it was framed as refusal to accept an explanation that relied on probability instead of verification. Mike was an experienced hunter and familiar with Lake Seminole. That experience did not make accidents impossible, but it made unexamined assumptions harder to accept. As months turned into years, the ruling remained unchanged. There was no active investigation to challenge. No appeals process existed for reopening an accidental death without new information. The system had moved on, leaving only personal resolve. During this time, Mike's mother pursued civil avenues. She filed lawsuits seeking answers and access to records. These actions were not criminal proceedings, but they kept the case from disappearing entirely. Court filings forced the circumstances of Mike's death back into formal review, even if the outcome did not change. The legal efforts drew attention to procedural decisions made early in the case. They highlighted how quickly the explanation had solidified and how limited the inquiry had been once the accident theory was accepted. These challenges did not overturn the ruling, but they preserved the questions. Public attention remained limited. Without law enforcement involvement, there was little reason for continued coverage. The case existed largely within court documents and personal memory rather than headlines. Despite this, Mike's mother continued to document inconsistencies. She noted the absence of blood. She questioned how equipment remained undisturbed. She pointed to the lack of confirmed evidence supporting the official cause. Each concern was logged, even if not acted upon. Her efforts represented a contrast between institutional closure and personal accountability. The system required proof to reopen a case. She required proof to accept its conclusion. Those standards did not align. Over time, these actions created a quiet record of dissent. While the official files reflected resolution, parallel records reflected doubt. That distinction mattered later, even if it had no immediate effect. The passage of time did not weaken her position. Instead, it reinforced the idea that unanswered questions do not disappear simply because they are inconvenient. The lack of review became part of the story. This period also exposed how easily an accidental death ruling can insulate a case from scrutiny. Without a criminal designation, there is no obligation to examine motive, relationships, or context. The ruling closed doors rather than opening them. Mike Williams' disappearance became a settled matter in law, but not in memory. For those closest to him, the explanation remained incomplete. The absence of further inquiry felt less like resolution and more like abandonment. Years passed with no movement. The lake remained the official answer. The records stayed closed, but the questions endured, documented through persistence rather than investigation. This sustained refusal to accept the explanation did not change the outcome immediately. What it did was preserve uncertainty in a system that prefers finality. It kept the case alive in a narrow but critical way. When new information eventually surfaced years later, it would not emerge into a vacuum. It would encounter a record shaped by early assumptions and later resistance. The persistence of one voice ensured that the case was never entirely forgotten. At this point in the timeline, nothing had changed in the eyes of law enforcement. The death was still considered accidental. No suspects existed. No crime was acknowledged. Yet the foundation beneath that conclusion was quietly eroding, not through evidence, but through unanswered questions that refused to disappear. The story remained suspended between closure and doubt, held in place by a ruling on paper and a refusal in practice. As years passed after the accidental death ruling, the disappearance of Mike Williams settled into official silence. With no criminal designation attached to the case, there were no active investigators, no periodic reviews, and no expectation of new findings. The file remained closed, unchanged by time or circumstance. The absence of movement created a long stretch where nothing advanced through formal channels. Law enforcement agencies did not revisit the evidence because, in their view, there was no crime to investigate. Without a body or forensic material, the case did not meet the threshold for further action. The conclusion already reached was treated as sufficient. During this period, records related to Mike Williams existed largely as administrative documents. Reports outlined the discovery of the boat, the environmental explanation, and the official determination. These records were stored rather than examined. There was no investigative momentum to challenge what had already been decided. Public attention faded almost entirely. Media coverage diminished as there were no updates to report. The story no longer appeared in headlines or broadcasts. Over time, it became a quiet footnote in local memory rather than an ongoing concern. Within Mike Williams' family, the lack of activity reinforced a sense of unresolved loss. While legal avenues had been explored earlier, there was little left to pursue without new information. The system required evidence to move forward, and none had emerged. At the same time, personal relationships connected to Mike continued without scrutiny. Because the case was not treated as criminal, there was no examination of interpersonal dynamics, finances, or circumstances beyond the day of disappearance. These areas remained outside the scope of review. The classification of accidental death effectively insulated the case from reassessment. It placed the disappearance in a category where uncertainty was acceptable and inquiry was optional. That categorization shaped how the years unfolded. From an institutional perspective, the case represented closure. Resources were allocated elsewhere. Investigators moved on to active matters. The disappearance of Mike Williams was not considered unfinished business. The long period without investigation also meant that memories aged and records remained static. Witness recollections were not refreshed. Statements were not revisited. The absence of follow-up allowed details to remain untested. This extended silence did not generate pressure for action. Without a triggering event, There was no mechanism to reopen discussion. The lake remained the explanation, and the explanation remained unchallenged within official systems. Time passed unevenly. For the system, the case was complete. For those who questioned the ruling, the passage of years added weight to unanswered questions. Each year without review deepened the gap between official certainty and personal doubt. The case's dormancy demonstrated how easily a disappearance can fade when labeled accidental. Without formal recognition of possible wrongdoing, there is no framework for accountability. Silence becomes the default outcome. Despite the lack of official movement, the record of the case remained intact. Reports were preserved, documents were stored. This preservation would later matter, even though it had no immediate effect during this period. The coldness of the case was not marked by dramatic loss of evidence or abandoned leads. It was marked by inaction. The absence of activity became the defining feature of these years. What appeared settled on paper remained unsettled beneath the surface. The lack of investigation did not resolve doubts, it simply delayed confrontation with them. This stretch of time established the conditions under which change could eventually occur. A case that appears resolved can still be reopened if new information arrives. The years of silence did not erase the past, they only postponed its examination. At this point in the record, nothing had altered the official conclusion. Mike Williams' death was still classified as an accident. There were no suspects. No crime existed in the eyes of the law. The case remained dormant, defined more by what was not done than by what was. The stillness of these years would later stand in contrast to what followed. For now, the disappearance remained frozen in time, untouched by investigation, and shielded by an explanation that had never been tested beyond its initial acceptance. After years of inactivity, the case surrounding Mike Williams changed direction not through routine review, but through information that did not exist when the original ruling was made. The explanation that had remained unchallenged for so long began to weaken when statements surfaced that conflicted with the accepted account of an accidental death. The shift did not begin with physical evidence, it began with people. Individuals connected to Mike Williams and those around him provided information that raised questions about the circumstances of his disappearance. These statements did not align with the environmental explanation that had closed the case years earlier. They introduced details that had never been examined because the case was not treated as criminal. Investigators were alerted to these developments through law enforcement channels rather than public reporting. The information was specific enough to require attention. It suggested that the events surrounding Mike's disappearance may not have been random or accidental. This marked the first time in years that authorities had a reason to revisit the case file. Law enforcement began reviewing the original reports. They examined how the conclusion had been reached and what had not been explored. The focus returned to the absence of a body, the condition of the boat, and the assumptions made based on wildlife presence. What had once been viewed as confirmation now appeared incomplete. As investigators conducted interviews, inconsistencies emerged. Timelines provided earlier were re-examined, statements were compared against each other and against known facts. The lack of scrutiny in the early years became apparent as new information filled gaps that had never been questioned. This renewed attention did not immediately result in public action. The review process unfolded quietly. Investigators assessed credibility and sought corroboration. The goal was not to overturn the previous ruling without cause, but to determine whether the original explanation could still stand. The information received suggested personal dynamics that had never been part of the record. Because the case was previously classified as accidental, relationships, financial matters, and communications were not examined at the time of disappearance. These areas now became relevant for the first time. Investigators approached the case cautiously. The passage of time complicated matters. Memories had faded and evidence was limited. However, the consistency of new statements and their alignment with unresolved questions from the original investigation gave the review momentum. Law enforcement agencies coordinated to determine jurisdiction and responsibility. Because the case had been closed, reopening it required procedural steps. Records were retrieved and reassessed. This process marked a clear departure from years of inactivity. The review revealed that the original conclusion rested heavily on probability rather than confirmation. The presence of alligators had been treated as sufficient explanation without direct evidence. New information challenged that reliance and suggested alternative possibilities that had not been explored. As investigators gathered more details, the narrative surrounding Mike Williams' disappearance began to shift internally. The case was no longer viewed solely through the lens of environmental risk. Human involvement became a consideration for the first time. This change did not occur abruptly. It developed through accumulation of information rather than a single revelation. Each statement added context that had been missing. Each inconsistency weakened the accidental death explanation. Law enforcement documented these findings carefully. The goal was to establish whether the new information justified formal reclassification. This required a standard of verification that had not been applied previously. During this period, the case remained officially unchanged. There were no arrests or public announcements. The investigation existed in review rather than action. However, the direction was clear. The disappearance was no longer viewed as resolved. The reopening of scrutiny also validated years of unanswered questions. Concerns raised earlier about the lack of evidence supporting the original conclusion now had institutional acknowledgement. What had once been dismissed as doubt became grounds for review. Investigators expanded their focus to include communications, movements, and relationships surrounding the disappearance. This represented a fundamental change in approach. The case was no longer about what the lake could explain. It was about what had been overlooked. The process required patience. The absence of physical evidence meant that corroboration depended heavily on consistency and documentation. Investigators were careful not to speculate, relying instead on what could be verified. As the review progressed, it became increasingly difficult to sustain the original ruling without addressing the new information. The case was approaching a point where a decision would need to be made regarding its classification. What had once been an accident by default was now a question requiring deliberate examination. The information reaching investigators did not provide immediate answers, but it reopened a door that had been closed for years. This moment marked the transition from silence to scrutiny. The case was no longer dormant, it was active again, driven not by assumption, but by information that demanded explanation. The arrival of this new information did not resolve the case, it changed its trajectory. It placed Mike Williams' disappearance back into the hands of investigators, where unanswered questions could finally be addressed through process rather than acceptance. From this point forward, the record would no longer reflect certainty without proof. The disappearance was no longer settled history. It had become an active matter once again, shaped by evidence that had been absent when the case was first closed. As investigators continued reviewing the information that had surfaced, the original framework of the case became increasingly difficult to maintain. The explanation that had closed the file years earlier no longer accounted for the details now documented. What had once been treated as an unfortunate accident began to resemble something else entirely. Law enforcement reassessed the disappearance using standards applied to potential criminal cases rather than environmental incidents. This shift changed the scope of inquiry. Instead of asking how Mike Williams might have fallen into the water, investigators examined whether his disappearance could have been caused by deliberate human action. The review returned to the physical facts known from the day Mike vanished. His boat had been found with the engine running. His hunting equipment was still inside. There was no damage indicating a violent encounter with wildlife near the boat. These observations had always existed in the record, but they had not been evaluated through a criminal lens. Investigators also considered the improbability of certain assumptions made earlier. While alligators were present in Lake Seminole, no physical evidence confirmed an attack. There were no remains, no blood, and no disturbance consistent with such an event occurring at the surface near the boat. The absence of evidence was no longer treated as confirmation of an accident. As statements were reviewed and corroborated, investigators began documenting inconsistencies between the original conclusion and the emerging information. Timelines that had once gone unquestioned were now examined closely. Movements and communications surrounding the disappearance were re-evaluated. This process required coordination across agencies. Because the case had been closed as accidental, reopening it involved procedural steps to ensure jurisdiction and authority were properly established. Records from the original search were retrieved. Reports were analyzed for gaps and assumptions. The accumulation of information reached a threshold where the original ruling could no longer be sustained. Investigators concluded that the accidental death classification did not adequately explain the circumstances. The case required a different designation. Law enforcement formally reclassified the disappearance of Mike Williams as a homicide. This decision marked a fundamental change in how the case would be handled. It acknowledged that the evidence and statements now available pointed toward intentional action rather than accident. The reclassification reopened investigative avenues that had been closed for years. It allowed authorities to examine relationships, financial records, and communications that were previously considered irrelevant. The case moved from explanation to investigation. This decision did not announce guilt. It did not name suspects publicly at that time. It established that Mike Williams' death was being treated as a crime. That distinction altered every aspect of the inquiry. Investigators began identifying individuals whose statements and actions required closer examination. Because years had passed, the process relied heavily on documentation rather than physical evidence. Records, timelines, and corroboration became central tools. The reclassification also validated long-standing concerns about the original ruling. Questions raised earlier about the absence of proof now had institutional recognition. The case was no longer insulated by assumption. Law enforcement officials approached the investigation cautiously. The passage of time created challenges. Memories had faded. Physical evidence was limited. However, the consistency of information and its alignment with unresolved questions provided the foundation for continued work. This phase of the case required careful handling. Reclassifying a death after many years carries significant responsibility. Investigators documented their reasoning thoroughly, ensuring that the decision was grounded in evidence rather than hindsight. The reclassification also changed how the case was viewed internally. It was no longer an anomaly explained by nature. It was a homicide that required resolution. As investigators moved forward, they began preparing for the possibility of recovery efforts. The absence of remains had long been cited as a barrier. New information suggested that recovery might be possible, even after many years. This development underscored the importance of preserving records. The original reports, though limited, provided a baseline against which new information could be compared. Without those records, reassessment would have been impossible. The decision to treat the case as a homicide did not immediately produce answers. It produced direction. It established that the disappearance of Mike Williams demanded explanation through investigation rather than acceptance. For the community, the reclassification marked a turning point. What had been remembered as a tragic accident was now understood as unresolved. The quiet certainty that had surrounded the case began to dissolve. The reclassification also reframed the timeline. Years of inactivity were no longer seen as closure, but as delay. The case was re-entered into the justice system with urgency shaped by time lost. From this point forward, every step carried weight. Investigators were aware that their actions would be scrutinized, both because of the seriousness of the allegation and because of the years that had passed without inquiry. The shift from accident to homicide altered the narrative permanently. It acknowledged that the original explanation had failed to account for critical elements. It opened the door to accountability. The disappearance of Mike Williams was no longer treated as a mystery explained by nature. It was treated as a crime requiring answers. This reclassification set the stage for what followed. It allowed investigators to pursue leads that had once been outside their reach. It transformed the case from a closed file into an active investigation. At this point in the record, the system had corrected its course. The lake was no longer the answer. The focus had turned to human action and responsibility. The case was no longer dormant. It had been brought back to life through process, evidence, and a willingness to re-examine what had once been accepted without proof. Once the case was formally treated as a homicide, investigators moved with focus that had been absent for years. The reclassification allowed law enforcement to pursue information that had previously been considered outside scope. Attention turned to individuals whose statements had contributed to reopening the case, and whose proximity to Mike Williams required careful examination. Investigators conducted extended interviews and compared accounts against documented timelines. Inconsistencies that had once gone unnoticed were now evaluated against each other. The process relied heavily on corroboration rather than assumption. Each detail was tested against records, travel history, and communications. As pressure increased, one account stood apart. Brian Winchester, a longtime friend of Mike Williams, provided information that went beyond what had previously been known. His statements aligned with unresolved questions from the original disappearance and with gaps identified during review. Investigators assessed credibility through verification rather than acceptance. Winchester ultimately provided a confession. He admitted that Mike Williams had not died in an accident. He stated that the disappearance had been staged to resemble one. According to his account, the boat, equipment, and circumstances were arranged to support the environmental explanation that had closed the case years earlier. The confession marked a decisive shift. For the first time, the case had direct admission of human involvement. Investigators documented the statement carefully and sought independent verification. Confessions alone are not sufficient. They must align with physical reality. Winchester provided information about the location of Mike Williams' remains. This information had never existed within the record before. Investigators organized recovery efforts based on the details given, aware that the passage of time posed challenges. Search teams moved to the area identified. The location was not Lake Seminole. It was a remote site where remains could have gone undetected for years. Law enforcement approached the recovery with forensic protocols, despite the condition expected after such a long period. Human remains were recovered. Forensic examination confirmed that they belonged to Mike Williams. This discovery eliminated the uncertainty that had defined the case since 2000. The absence of a body had once supported the accidental death ruling. Its recovery now dismantled that explanation entirely. The condition and location of the remains were consistent with Winchester's account and inconsistent with an alligator attack. This alignment provided independent confirmation of the confession. Investigators documented findings through forensic and procedural channels to ensure evidentiary integrity. The recovery of remains transformed the case from reconstructed narrative to documented fact. What had been inferred through statements was now supported by physical evidence. The homicide classification was no longer provisional, it was confirmed. law enforcement expanded the investigation to include others implicated through the confession and supporting evidence. The focus shifted from determining what happened to establishing responsibility. The recovery also closed a long-standing gap in the record. For years, the absence of remains had prevented forensic confirmation. That barrier no longer existed. Investigators now had a complete timeline from disappearance to recovery. Public disclosure followed official procedures. Authorities announced that Mike Williams' remains had been found and that the case involved homicide. The announcement corrected years of public understanding. What had been presented as an accident was now acknowledged as a crime. The confession and recovery also reframed the actions taken in 2000. The environmental explanation was no longer a matter of probability. It was a deliberate misdirection that had succeeded because of early assumptions. Investigators documented how the staged elements aligned with the original ruling. The running engine, the undisturbed equipment, and the absence of a body were no longer coincidences. They were part of a constructed scenario. This phase of the case required careful documentation because of its implications. The confession implicated more than one individual and challenged institutional conclusions made years earlier. Investigators ensured that each claim was verified independently. The recovery process adhered to forensic standards despite time elapsed. Evidence was preserved and analyzed within the limits imposed by condition. The goal was confirmation rather than detail beyond what could be responsibly determined. For Mike Williams' family, the recovery brought factual certainty. Years of absence were replaced by documentation. While the loss remained, uncertainty did not. The truth, supported by evidence, had emerged. The confession also underscored the impact of early misclassification. A staged scene had gone unquestioned because it fit an accepted narrative. The recovery demonstrated how easily assumptions can shape outcomes. From an investigative perspective, this moment validated the decision to reopen the case. Without reclassification, the confession and recovery would not have occurred. The process demonstrated the importance of revisiting conclusions when new information emerges. The recovery of remains closed one chapter of uncertainty, but opened another of accountability. Investigators now had the foundation required to pursue charges and proceed through the justice system. This development also altered public understanding. What had been remembered as a tragic accident was now recognized as a calculated act that exploited environmental assumptions. The confession and recovery marked the point where speculation ended entirely. The case was no longer defined by theory or probability, it was defined by admission and evidence. From this moment forward, the investigation moved from discovery to prosecution. The facts were established. The question was no longer what happened to Mike Williams, but how the justice system would respond. The disappearance that had remained unresolved for nearly 20 years was now explained through verified record rather than inference. The lake no longer held the answer. The truth had been recovered from elsewhere. This stage represented the most significant turning point in the case. It replaced silence with evidence and assumption with confirmation. The path towards accountability was now clear, built on confession, recovery, and verified fact rather than environmental explanation. With the remains recovered and the confession documented, the case entered its next phase. The focus shifted fully to legal responsibility, supported by a record that no longer relied on absence but on proof. With the confession documented and the remains recovered, the investigation moved decisively into prosecution. What had been rebuilt through review and verification now required formal action under law. Investigators compiled evidence into case files, prepared for charging decisions, ensuring that each element met legal standards rather than narrative expectation. Authorities evaluated the confession alongside corroborating records. Travel data, timelines, and communications were assembled to support the account provided. The goal was not to rely on admission alone, but to establish a foundation that could withstand judicial scrutiny. Each piece was examined for consistency with physical findings and documented history. Brian Winchester was taken into custody and formally charged in connection with the killing of Mike Williams. The charge reflected the role admitted through his statements and confirmed through investigation. The arrest marked the first time the case entered the criminal justice system as a homicide rather than an unexplained event. The charging documents outlined how the disappearance had been staged to resemble an accident. They described the deliberate actions taken to mislead investigators and the intent behind them. These documents relied on verified facts rather than interpretation, presenting a sequence supported by evidence. Attention then turned to Denise Williams. Investigators examined her involvement based on information uncovered during the reopened investigation and statements connected to the confession. Financial records, communications, and personal relationships were reviewed to determine whether her actions met the threshold for criminal liability. Authorities arrested Denise Williams and charged her with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and accessory after the fact. The charges reflected allegations that she had participated in planning and benefited from the crime rather than carrying it out directly. This distinction was central to how the case would proceed. The arrests represented a clear transition from investigation to accountability. After years of silence, the case now moved through formal legal channels. Prosecutors prepared to present evidence before a court rather than evaluate it internally. Both defendants were processed through standard procedures. Bail considerations, court appearances, and pre-trial motions followed. The focus shifted to legal rights, evidentiary rules, and procedural fairness. The case was no longer shaped by investigation alone. Public announcement of the arrests corrected a narrative that had existed for nearly 2 decades. What had been accepted as an accident was now formally described as a homicide involving planning and deception. Officials communicated the charges without elaboration beyond the record. The community responded with restraint. The length of time between the disappearance and the arrests shaped reaction. Surprise was accompanied by recognition that the explanation long accepted had been incomplete. The arrests also underscored the consequences of early assumptions. The staged elements of the disappearance had succeeded because they aligned with environmental expectations. The charging documents highlighted how that alignment delayed accountability. Prosecutors emphasized that the case relied on evidence gathered after reopening, rather than reinterpretation of old assumptions. The charges were grounded in new information, verified through process. Defense counsel entered the case as required. Pre-trial proceedings began to shape the path forward. The justice system moved into its adversarial phase, governed by rules distinct from investigation. The arrest of Denise Williams carried particular weight because of her proximity to Mike Williams and the years that had passed without suspicion. The charges reframed the personal history surrounding the disappearance through legal definition rather than rumor. Investigators remained involved to support prosecution. Their role shifted from discovery to documentation and testimony preparation. Every statement and recovery detail was preserved for court. The arrests also highlighted the importance of corroboration in delayed cases. Confession alone did not drive charging decisions. Alignment between statements, records, and physical evidence did. The case files presented a structured narrative supported by fact. Prosecutors prepared to demonstrate intent, action, and concealment through documented steps rather than emotional appeal. The criminal charges ensured that responsibility would be tested through legal process. The outcome would depend on evidence presented before a judge and jury, rather than public perception. For Mike Williams's family, the arrests provided formal acknowledgement that the disappearance had been the result of a crime. Years of uncertainty were replaced by defined allegations subject to adjudication. The transition into prosecution marked the final departure from the accidental death ruling. The justice system now treated the case as intentional harm, followed by concealment. This shift carried implications for sentencing, appeals, and historical record. The arrests also demonstrated how cold cases can advance rapidly once key information is verified. Years of inactivity were followed by decisive action grounded in evidence rather than assumption. As the defendants faced court proceedings, the case entered a new phase defined by legal standards. The investigation had done its work. The responsibility now rested with the courts to determine guilt and consequence. The arrests did not resolve the case. They initiated its most scrutinized stage. Evidence would be tested, credibility examined, and decisions rendered through due process. At this point in the record, the disappearance of Mike Williams was no longer unresolved. It had been transformed into a criminal case with named defendants, formal charges, and a clear path forward through the justice system. Once criminal charges were filed, the case moved into a phase governed by courtroom procedure rather than investigative discretion. Evidence that had been assembled over years of review, verification, and recovery was now subject to formal testing under the rules of law. What had been established internally by investigators had to be demonstrated publicly through admissible record. Brian Winchester's case reached resolution first. Prosecutors presented the evidence supporting his role in the killing of Mike Williams, including his confession and the corroborating facts that aligned with it. The court reviewed how his statements matched travel records, timing, and the recovery location of the remains. The focus remained on verification rather than narrative detail. Winchester entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder. The plea acknowledged intentional killing and waived the right to a jury trial. Before accepting the plea, the court confirmed that it was entered knowingly and voluntarily. The admission established legal responsibility and removed factual dispute from further consideration. The guilty plea also carried procedural significance. It allowed prosecutors to rely on Winchester's admission as part of the record in related proceedings. His acknowledgement of responsibility provided clarity that had been absent for nearly 2 decades. Attention then shifted to Denise Williams, whose case proceeded to trial. Unlike Winchester, she did not admit guilt. Prosecutors were required to establish her involvement through evidence rather than confession. The charges centered on conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and accessory after the fact. The prosecution presented records showing communication, financial arrangements, and coordination. These materials were introduced to demonstrate planning and benefit rather than physical action. The case did not allege that Denise Williams carried out the killing herself. It alleged participation through agreement and assistance. Jurors were presented with timelines reconstructed from documentation rather than memory. Phone records, financial transactions, and travel data were introduced to establish sequence and intent. Each element was offered to show how actions aligned with the disappearance and its staging. The defense challenged whether the evidence met the legal standard for conspiracy. Arguments focused on interpretation rather than denial of events. The court evaluated whether actions attributed to Denise Williams satisfied statutory definitions rather than moral judgment. Witness testimony was structured to address specific legal elements. Statements were examined for consistency with records already in evidence. The court limited testimony to admissible material, excluding speculation and character assessment. The length of time between the disappearance and the trial was acknowledged through judicial instruction. Jurors were directed to consider evidence as presented, not the delay itself. Time was context, not proof. Prosecutors emphasized how the disappearance was framed as an accident, and how that framing delayed scrutiny. Evidence demonstrated how environmental assumptions were exploited, and how that exploitation benefited those involved. The argument relied on documented outcomes rather than emotional framing. The court reviewed expert testimony explaining how staged scenes can influence investigative conclusions. This testimony addressed method and effect rather than motive. It focused on how certain arrangements can lead to premature closure. Throughout the proceedings, the court maintained focus on process. Evidence was weighed based on reliability and relevance. Arguments were confined to record. The adversarial system functioned within defined boundaries. After deliberation, the jury returned verdicts finding Denise Williams guilty on charges of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and accessory after the fact. The verdicts reflected the jury's determination that the evidence met the required legal standard. The verdicts formally assigned responsibility through the justice system. What had been disputed for years was now resolved through jury decision rather than assumption. The outcome replaced uncertainty with documented conclusion. The trial also clarified how responsibility can be distributed differently under law. Winchester's guilty plea addressed direct action. Williams' conviction addressed coordination and concealment. The distinction mattered legally and procedurally. Public reaction to the verdicts remained restrained. The length of time between the disappearance and trial shaped expectations. The focus remained on accountability rather than reaction. The verdicts also reframed the history of the case. What had been recorded as an accident was now officially documented as a homicide involving planning and deception. The judicial record corrected earlier assumptions through evidence and due process. Following the verdicts, the case moved toward sentencing. The factual phase had concluded. The court's role shifted from determining guilt to determining consequence. For Mike Williams' family, the verdicts provided legal acknowledgement of responsibility. Years of doubt were replaced by findings supported by record. While the verdicts did not undo loss, they established truth within the system designed to address such harm. The trial demonstrated how delayed cases can still be resolved when evidence is preserved and evaluated properly. Time complicated the process, but did not prevent accountability. The courtroom proceedings marked the point where investigation yielded to judgment. The justice system had weighed evidence, tested claims, and rendered decisions based on law rather than assumption. At this stage, the case no longer depended on reconstruction alone. It rested on verdicts reached through process. The disappearance of Mike Williams was no longer unresolved history. It was a crime addressed through trial, testimony, and lawful decision. With verdicts entered, the remaining step concerned sentencing. Responsibility had been established. What remained was the formal determination of punishment, guided by statute and judicial review rather than dispute. The trials closed the longest chapter of uncertainty in the case. They replaced years of silence with documented accountability, achieved through evidence, examination, and verdict, rather than explanation by default. After verdicts were entered, the case moved into its final legal determination. The focus shifted away from proof and toward consequence. Responsibility had been established through plea and jury decision. What remained was the court's obligation to impose sentences consistent with Florida law and the facts accepted into record. Brian Winchester was sentenced first. Because he had entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder, The court addressed punishment within the framework agreed upon during plea proceedings. The sentence reflected intentional killing and the extended concealment that followed. The court imposed life imprisonment, ensuring that Winchester would remain incarcerated for the remainder of his life. The sentence removed any possibility of release and formally closed his role in the criminal process. The court reviewed pre-sentence documentation before imposing punishment. These materials summarized the crime, the length of time the death remained undiscovered, and the impact on Mike Williams's family. Sentencing was grounded in statute rather than discretion beyond what the law allowed. Attention then turned to Denise Williams. Following her conviction for conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and accessory after the fact, the court evaluated sentencing factors specific to her role. The law required distinction between direct action and participation through planning and concealment. That distinction shaped the outcome. Denise Williams was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the conspiracy conviction, along with an additional sentence for accessory after the fact. The sentences were ordered to run consecutively. The court determined that the severity of planning and deception justified the maximum penalty permitted by law. The sentencing hearing remained procedural and restrained. The court addressed statutory requirements, reviewed the jury's findings, and imposed punishment accordingly. There was no reconsideration of guilt. That phase had ended with the verdicts. For Mike Williams's family, sentencing marked the conclusion of criminal proceedings. Years of uncertainty were replaced by permanent legal outcomes. The justice system had completed its role in assigning consequence for the crime. The sentences also corrected the historical record. What had once been documented as an accidental death was now conclusively recorded as homicide, supported by conviction and punishment. The legal system replaced assumption with adjudication. Public reporting emphasized the finality of sentencing. Coverage focused on the length and nature of the sentences rather than emotional reaction. The case was no longer developing, it had reached resolution within the courts. The sentencing outcomes eliminated the need for further factual hearings. Appeals remained a possibility as a matter of right, but the criminal phase had ended. The convictions and sentences stood as the official resolution of the case. The court's decisions reflected how accountability is enforced through law rather than narrative. Punishment was imposed based on defined roles, statutory limits, and evidence accepted into record. Emotion did not drive outcome, process did. The case also illustrated how delayed justice can still reach finality. Time complicated investigation and prosecution, but it did not prevent sentencing once responsibility was established. With sentencing complete, law enforcement agencies concluded their involvement. Prosecutors closed files, court records were finalized. The case transitioned from active proceedings to permanent record. The sentences ensured that the individuals responsible would face lifelong consequence. They also ensured that the disappearance of Mike Williams would no longer exist as an unresolved event within public record. For the community, sentencing provided certainty. The case no longer rested on unanswered questions or disputed explanations. It rested on verdicts and punishment imposed through lawful procedure. The legal finality did not erase the years when the case remained misclassified. It acknowledged them indirectly by demonstrating what happens when assumptions are corrected through evidence. The sentencing phase reinforced the distinction between explanation and accountability. Early explanations had closed the case prematurely. Accountability arrived later through confession, recovery, trial, and judgment. With punishment imposed, the justice system completed its work. The disappearance that began on Lake Seminole ended not with environmental explanation, but with legal consequence. The record now reflects a complete sequence from disappearance to sentencing. Each stage is documented through investigation, prosecution, and judgment. The case stands resolved within law, defined by accountability rather than absence. What remains beyond sentencing is not further legal action, but reflection on how the case unfolded and what it revealed about assumptions, persistence, and the capacity of the justice system to correct itself, even after many years. With sentencing complete, the legal process surrounding Mike Williams' death reached its endpoint, but the case continued to carry weight beyond court records. The disappearance, misclassification, and eventual resolution left lasting effects on the people involved, the community, and the systems responsible for investigating unexplained deaths. For Mike Williams' family, the outcome replaced years of uncertainty with documented truth. The absence that defined daily life for nearly 2 decades was finally addressed through evidence and law. Accountability did not restore what was lost, but it ended speculation and confirmed responsibility within the justice system. The distinction mattered. It transformed a long-held explanation into a verified record. The case reshaped how the community understood the original disappearance. What had been accepted as a tragic accident was reconsidered through the lens of evidence rather than assumption. This shift challenged the belief that environmental danger alone can explain unexplained loss. It also reinforced that early conclusions can shape outcomes for years. From an investigative standpoint, the case highlighted the consequences of premature closure. The original ruling relied on probability instead of confirmation. Once that explanation took hold, inquiry stopped. Relationships, communications, and context were excluded from review. The case demonstrated how quickly a file can become insulated from scrutiny when labeled accidental. The reopening showed the value of persistence and record preservation. Reports, statements, and administrative documents remained available long after the disappearance. Those materials allowed investigators to reassess decisions using new information. Without preservation, re-evaluation would not have been possible. The case also illustrated the importance of corroboration. The confession that changed the direction of the investigation was verified through independent evidence. Recovery of remains, alignment with records, and consistency across sources ensured that accountability rested on proof rather than admission alone. Procedural challenges exposed vulnerabilities within the justice system. Early assumptions delayed accountability. Later administrative errors required correction. These issues did not change the outcome, but they underscored the need for precision at every stage. Accuracy is not optional. It determines whether cases move forward or remain unresolved. The role of time emerged as both obstacle and test. Years complicated investigation, faded memories, and limited physical evidence. At the same time, time did not erase responsibility. The case showed that accountability can still be established when evidence is verified and evaluated carefully. Public reassessment followed the legal resolution. Media coverage shifted from environmental explanation to investigative failure and correction. The focus remained on process rather than spectacle. This restraint reflected the seriousness of the outcome and the responsibility involved in reporting delayed justice. The case also offered lessons about how disappearance cases are categorized. Adult missing persons are often treated differently from other unexplained events. When danger is assumed rather than proven, inquiry can end prematurely. The Williams case demonstrated the risk of that approach. For law enforcement, the case reinforced the need for flexibility. Reclassification is not an admission of error. It is a recognition that new information requires new response. The willingness to reopen the case was essential to its resolution. The justice system ultimately corrected its course. What began as an explanation by default ended as accountability by law. That correction required persistence, verification, and procedural care, rather than urgency or pressure. The case now stands as a complete record. A disappearance once explained by assumption was resolved through evidence. Responsibility was assigned through confession, trial, and sentencing. The record no longer reflects absence or probability, it reflects verified fact. What remains are lessons grounded in outcome rather than theory. Early classification matters, preservation matters, review matters. Accountability may arrive late, but it is not erased by time. Mike Williams' case does not end with closure as an emotion, it ends with accountability as a fact. The justice system fulfilled its role by replacing assumption with proof and silence with record. The case serves as a reminder that explanations should never substitute for evidence. When questions remain unanswered, they deserve attention, even if that attention arrives years later.